Well, good evening. Tonight I decided to do a talk kind of bringing us up to date on the changes that have been occurring in the breeding avifauna on the Channel Islands. This period of time from about 1950 to the present is a period showing dramatic changes on the Channel Islands in terms of land use and in terms of what's happening with the island habitats. And those changes are having some fairly significant effects on some of the native species and introduced species that occur on the islands. And so, without further ado, I'm going to be covering a period from about the 1950s to the present, but the real focus of the changes is 1980 up to the present, because in 1980 there were several papers published in the Second Channel Island Symposium, one on the breeding land birds of the Channel Islands and one on the breeding seabirds of the Channel Islands, that form kind of a base of what was known up to that point in terms of the populations of seabirds and land birds on the Channel Islands. See if we can get it to move. Oops. Oh, there we go. Got it? Yeah. Okay. Now we got it. Technology. What did you do? Oh, okay. I see it. Okay, got it. Oops. So the things I'm going to cover tonight, first off, is to kind of describe the factors that have been affecting bird populations in and around and on the Channel Islands. Second is to talk specifically about this period of herbivore disturbance on the islands. So when did herbivores get to each of the islands, and when were the last herbivores taken off the islands, which sets the end date and the beginning date for recovery of vegetative community structure on islands. Next is to kind of do an overview of how habitats have been changing following the removal of herbivores on the island. And then once I've set that kind of background, I'll go through by broad ecological groups the changes that have occurred on the 8 Channel Islands in each of the broad ecological groups. Again, using 1980 for the land bird data and 1992 for the seabird data in terms of what was breeding on the islands in 1980 for land birds and 1992 for seabirds. And I'll update the totals on the breeding avifauna on each of the islands, and then identify and talk a little bit about how these changes in habitats are going to have positive effects for some species and negative effects for other species. So who are the winners and losers as the habitats are changing? So again, this talk is focused not just on Channel Islands National Park islands, the 5 islands, which all of you know make up the Northern Channel Islands and Santa Barbara Island, but it includes the Southern Channel Islands in this overall discussion tonight. The data that's used for this presentation come from a wide variety of sources. In particular, some of the records are in published papers. Some of the data comes out of unpublished seabird contract reports. Nowadays in eBird, people post checklists to eBird of birds and observations they've made on the islands. And sometimes they record data of breeding observations of birds. Also, there's several U.S. Fish and Wildlife breeding bird surveys that have been conducted on Santa Cruz Island, and then a more intensive one on Santa Catalina. And then the land bird point count monitoring surveys that the park has been doing for over 20 years on a number of the park islands. And then finally, unpublished photographs and observational data that I've gotten a hold of, that people have submitted to me. either called me, sent me emails, sent me a letter. It comes from a lot of sources. So first off, for seabirds, the primary factors that seem to be affecting breeding populations are whether they're increasing or decreasing or disappearing from locations on the islands. First and foremost is human disturbance during the breeding season at a seabird colony. Next would be predation by native and introduced mammals and avian predators. And then pollution and contaminants. We know that DDT caused eggshell thinning in a number of species on the Channel Islands: brown pelicans, double-crested cormorants, ashy storm petrels, peregrine falcons, and bald eagles. And it caused really dramatic population declines in the latter part of the 1960s and early 1970s. And so there were real constraints on bird populations for those species during that time window. And then more recently, this nocturnal light pollution from nearshore commercial squid fisheries that have been operating close to the islands during the breeding season have resulted in increased predation on some of the seabirds that nest and that come to their nest sites at night when they're visiting the nest sites. And they're getting preyed on by owls and by other predators. And so petrels and alcids both are being affected by that. And then finally, we know that for seabirds, their changes in their populations, they cycle through time. And it oftentimes is linked to the relative abundance and success of given breeding populations for certain species of seabirds in the Southern California Bight is really driven by the oceanographic conditions. And we know that El Nino and La Nina events sometimes and Pacific decadal oscillations can affect the distribution abundance of the preferred prey for species that are breeding there. And if that preferred prey disappears from close proximity to the islands during the breeding season or in the middle of the breeding season, then you see large population declines and loss of breeding success in populations. So for land birds, it's really driven by habitat. So alteration of the terrestrial habitats from the long-term overgrazing was the principal factor that's kind of altered the land bird community structure on the Channel Islands for the last 150 years. Predation from native and introduced mammals and avian predators and black rats are also a factor that affect breeding land birds. And then more recently, it's been the successional change that's occurring on the Channel Islands as a result of as herbivores have been removed from the islands and the islands are beginning to revegetate back into more native habitats. In addition, we have a whole series of conservation efforts that have been contributing to the change in breeding land birds on the Channel Islands. First and foremost would be the eradication of the introduced mammals on the islands. So the removal of all the feral herbivores, the eradication of black rats on Anacapa Island 2001 to 2002, the eradication of feral cats on San Nicolas Island, the active work that went on to reintroduce bald eagles back on, and bald eagles and peregrine falcons back onto the Channel Islands and to reestablish them as dominant breeding birds on the island. The decline and subsequent recovery of the northern Channel Islands fox populations, the period of decline and when foxes were out of the environment resulted in some changes and some species coming in beginning to breed that had never been recorded before on the islands. And then the removal of the golden eagles on the northern Channel Islands was an active management program. And then finally, the intensive conservation efforts that have gone on for the individual species that had declined, like San Clemente loggerhead shrike, and some of the seabirds like scripps murrelets, cassins auklets, and ashy storm petrels. And then finally, the principal thing that's occurring is this revegetation and passive recovery of native habitats that's happening on the Channel Islands following the removal of feral herbivores. So if we speak about the herbivores, there's a wide array of different types of grazing animals that were introduced onto the islands. The first group is a group that I call the livestock. These are animals that man brought out and as part of ranching operations on the islands. And it's composed primarily of sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, with sheep being the species that had the most dramatic effect on terrestrial habitats on the islands in the latter part of the 1800s. But there's another group of herbivores called game animals, which ranchers introduced onto some of the islands in order to have stock that they could hunt and have hunting programs on the islands. And these are a few: Barbary sheep, mule deer, snow deer, and elk. bison on Catalina Island. So there's a wide array of those kinds of introduced game species. So for the islands, to figure out when these things got to the islands and when they came off, you can start with a whole series of mining those historical photographs that are tied to dates and locations, and you can kind of document the presence of some of these introduced animals from the historical photographic record. But there's a wide array of other sources that you can use, from newspaper articles in the 1800s to legal documents and land transfers that describe the resources that were on the island. All of those feed into what's allowed us to kind of come up with those beginning and end dates for when introduced mammals were on the island. So for San Miguel Island, herbivores were present starting in about 1851, and the last herbivores were taken off in 1976 by the Park Service, which was the burrows that were still on the island. For Santa Rosa Island, the herbivores got there in about 1844, and the last herbivore, the mule deer, I think the last of them came off, I think in 2015, somewhere around there, fairly recently. Santa Cruz Island, this 1855 painting by James Madison Alden shows the ranch here in the Central Valley, and you can see they already had a ranching operation going, and this photograph from 1869 shows an active ranch program, and you can see habitats are already being decimated by the grazing activity that was going on the island, even by 1869. Santa Barbara Island, herbivores, we think sometime prior to 1863, and then by 1946, after World War II, the last of the sheep were finally taken off. And then in 1981, the feral rabbits were finally removed from Santa Barbara Island. San Nicolas Island, it's 1856 for feral herbivores introductions to the island, and that lasted until 1949, when the last of the sheep were taken off of San Nicolas Island, and the grazing operation was shut down by the Navy. San Clemente Island, it was 1853 to 1993, and this is one of the pictures of how they gathered up the sheep and how they shipped them off the island. So if you put all of these end dates into a table, the top part speaks to rabbits, rats, and cats. You can see, first off, look for the P's that are in yellow that are on the table. That tells you that there's still populations of those particular species present on that particular island. So for black rats, we still have them present on San Miguel Island, Santa Catalina, and San Clemente. So their presence is still impacting species of land birds and seabirds on the islands where black rats still occur. They've been eradicated from Anacapa Island in 2001 and 2002. Cats have been taken off all of the islands except for Santa Catalina and San Clemente, with the last removal happening on San Nicolas in 2010. Below the yellow line, as you look at this, these are all the herbivores. And so again, the only island that has any P's left for populations that are still present is Catalina. And so the way I arrange these tables from here on out in the talk, as you look at this, it's going to go north to south. So as you look at this, it'll be San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, Anacapa, Santa Barbara, San Nicolas, Catalina, and San Clemente. And I try to keep that organization so you have an understanding of which island you're dealing with the respective data. Anyway, so we're left now on the Channel Islands with only Catalina Island still having some herbivores. But the reason I did this was because it's important to understand when the islands were herbivore free, when each island was free of herbivore impacts. And so the earliest island to be free of herbivore impacts was Anacapa Island. Let's see, right here, 1937. And then we go to 1946 for Santa Barbara Island, 1949 for San Nicolas, 1976 for San Miguel, 1993 for San Clemente, 2006 with the removal of the last feral pigs on Santa Cruz Island, and then 2015 for Santa Rosa Island. These are the dates when you no longer have that disturbance of herbivores affecting the terrestrial habitats. So vegetation's, the kinds of vegetation changes that have occurred following the removal of herbivores. First off, there's been a reduction in erosion and soil compaction. There's also been a reduction in the amount of disturbed bare ground. There's been a reduction in the amount of introduced annual grassland habitat. And for that grassland habitat that remains, there's been an increase in the density of the vegetative cover of the grassland and the remaining grassland, and an increase in the amount of thatch buildup in the grassland, which is that dry residual matter that the grass dying each year is building up and building a thick thatch layer. There's also been an increase in the native scrublands and woodlands on the islands. And so what this means is that the mean overstory cover of coastal sage scrub, chaparral, and bishop pine woodlands on Santa Cruz Island have been increasing. And there's been an increasing in shrub seedling regeneration, plant species richness, and basal sprouting of shrubs, and a development of this subshrub vegetation under woodlands, and the absence of any browse lines that had been created by herbivores in both the scrublands and woodlands. There's also been a dramatic recovery in the emergent freshwater marsh habitat, and riparian habitats are starting to show improvements as a result of the removal of grazing pressure in the understories. So we have an increase in the overall cover of emergent marsh vegetation, an increase in the canopy cover of riparian vegetation, and a reduction in the creek bank and bed erosion. So now I'm going to show you a series of pictures, paired pictures, over different time intervals so that you can actually see how these changes have been occurring on the islands. So most of these are coming from Santa Cruz Island. A few will be from Santa Rosa Island. But this is two pictures, represents 28-year time span. So when feral animals were present on Santa Cruz Island, this is what it looked like. And here's 28 years later. You can, from the same perspective, the same location, you can see the dramatic change in that vegetative community structure. That change is driving changes in the breeding avifauna on the Channel Islands. So, one of the pictures didn't pop in. This shows 33 years later. It shows what it looks like now. I had another picture up there that isn't showing up. Anyway, dramatic change, a lot more scrub cover, density of grass has increased. This is the Central Valley on Santa Cruz Island over a 37-year time window with the earliest period in 1971 when they had grazing animals still present and sheep around. And then you just fast forward all the way through to 2008. Really dramatic in terms of the amount of vegetative cover on the island. This is out towards looking out the Christie Valley to the west. Again, about a 30-year time window in these three images from when grazers were there. Oops. So when grazers were there, and then 30 years later when they weren't. Doesn't look like these pictures loaded, so I'm not sure why. Anyway, this picture shows that dramatic change. This was all bare ground along the slopes here, and it's filled in with vegetative cover, and pines are starting to seed into it. Pine forest is expanding on Santa Cruz Island. This is Lobo Canyon on Santa Rosa Island. This is freshwater marsh that's developed in the floor of Lobo Canyon. Dramatic. I mean, it's changing the understory, the structure of the floor of that canyon. And we now have Virginia rails there as a year-round resident in this habitat. So we're pretty sure that they're breeding in this habitat now on Santa Rosa Island. This is a 17-year time window for Old Ranch Canyon on Santa Rosa Island when cattle were present in 1995. And then fast forward to 2012, and you can see what's happened in the habitat. I mean, we have freshwater marsh in here. We have scrubland up on the flats, and we no longer have this stream bed erosion that's occurring and bank cutting that's happening. And then on Santa Rosa Island, Windmill Canyon, this is again a 17-year comparison. When cattle were present in 1995, you can see that there was almost no willow woodland along the floor of the drainage, and it was grassland on the adjacent creek banks. And look at 2012. It's a solid canopy of willow woodland down the floor of the drainage now. So with that as a background, I'm going to speak to how these different ecological groupings of birds have been changing across the 8 islands from 1980 to the present. And the way in which I present the data in these tables, as you look at this, anything that's in yellow, so like if I've got a species listed in yellow, it means it's a new breeding record, hadn't been recorded in either the 1980 publication or the 1992 publication for seabirds. If it isn't in yellow, it means that there's a population that had already been recorded as breeding on at least one of the islands. But if there's been a change in the status of that species on some of the other islands, then it'll be noted in yellow. So you can look at this fairly quickly and you can see here are a whole series of species that were introduced onto the islands during the period of the ranching years. Some of them were successful and became breeders, like Gambel's quail and chukar. So we have chukar on two of the islands, San Nicolas and San Clemente. And then some that failed. They attempted to breed and then died out. And then more recently, Indian peafowl and wild turkey were actively eradicated by the Nature Conservancy on Santa Cruz Island. So they've been removed. And the ranchers actually took quail from Catalina Island and introduced them to Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa, and we now have breeding populations of Catalina, California quail established on Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz Islands. So you can see how each of those are island-specific changes that are happening. And then there have been introductions to lots of islands where those introductions failed. We have no indications that the birds that were introduced survived and bred successfully and established a population for a short period of time. They seemed to die out soon after they were introduced. So the foxes island foxes played a role probably in that removal. Freshwater marsh breeders, this includes waterfowl, grebes, rails, and coots, and a few land birds. So as we look at the water birds, it's the larger islands where we have breeding records for the water birds. We have a series of new breeding records. So as we look at the new breeding records, it would be gadwall, cinnamon teal, pie-billed grebe, common gallinule, and common yellowthroat. Gadwall, a single breeding record for Santa Rosa Island. Cinnamon teal, a single breeding record for San Nicolas Island. Pie-billed grebe, a single record for Catalina Island. Common gallinule, I actually found a historic egg set in a museum collection back in Michigan that was collected on Catalina Island in the early 1900s, establishing the breeding presence of this species way back in the early part of the 1900s on Catalina Island. And then common yellowthroat, we have recent documentation for breeding on at least 3 breeding attempts on Santa Catalina, and suggestions that they're also attempting to breed in marsh habitat on Santa Cruz Island. So again, Virginia rail, we've got them there year-round now in Lobo Canyon. In all likelihood, they're breeding. They're difficult to find their nests, so we don't have actual nests that have been found. And ruddy duck, we've added another island, two breeding records for San Nic. And on mallards, we've got them breeding now on Santa Rosa, and San Nicolas, and San Clemente Island. So we've added a series of islands. So it's all of those larger islands that have man-made impoundments or small lakes that have been built have created habitat that those waterfowl are now using. So if we look at the raptors, of all of the species of raptors, we have 3 that are new breeders to the islands. White-tailed kite has bred occasionally on San Clemente Island. Northern harrier, documented breeding on San Miguel Island. During that time period when island foxes had been removed into captive breeding facilities on the islands, you no longer had a terrestrial carnivore in the environment. And as a result, the mouse populations exploded, and it allowed northern harriers to create and stay year-round and to actually nest. They're a ground nester. And they bred for 2 to 3 years. And then island foxes was reintroduced, and northern harriers no longer breed on the island. So it's an in-out cycle for breeding. During that same time window, we had evidence, observational data that suggested they were also breeding on 3 of the other islands. Golden eagles started breeding on Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa Islands somewhere in the 1980s, and they were finally trapped and relocated off the islands by 2006. So they no longer breed on these 2 islands. Peregrine falcons were reintroduced back onto the Channel Islands, and they're now breeding on all 8 of the Channel Islands, with San Nicolas Island being a new island breeding record because they'd never been recorded historically breeding on San Nic. American kestrels' status hasn't changed other than their abundance has changed. as a breeder on some of the islands. Herons and shorebirds. We have two different species of herons recorded breeding on the Channel Islands. Both of them are new, and I list them as new because all of the early literature for great blue heron just says they breed on the islands, but there's never been a documented case of them breeding on the islands. Never published any observational data of confirmed nests or eggs collected to actually confirm it. Well, we now have confirmed breeding evidence for Santa Rosa, Santa Catalina, and just recently San Clemente, and breeding behavior, which is suggestive of breeding for Santa Cruz Island. I've documented breeding of black-crowned night herons now on Catalina Island in and around Avalon, which is the first time they bred on any of the Channel Islands. Black-necked stilt, one breeding record for Santa Rosa Island. And then American oystercatchers, which is an interesting species. And I have a picture down here showing a black oystercatcher and a hybrid American oystercatcher. And we have these hybrid American oystercatchers, or supposed hybrids, that are now pairing up with black oystercatchers, and we have evidence of them actively breeding as pairs on all of these islands now. And so they're hybridizing with the black oystercatcher. Snowy plovers, the breeding status has changed on several of the islands. So they used to be a resident breeder on San Miguel, and they haven't for the last few years. And they're an occasional breeder now on San Clemente Island. And then Kildare, we've added 3 additional islands with confirmed breeding evidence: San Miguel, San Nicolas, and San Clemente Island. Storm petrels and pelicans and cormorants, no new species breeding records for the islands, but we have a series of new breeding populations on particular islands. So as you look at the storm petrels, ashy storm petrels now confirmed breeding on Anacapa Island and San Clemente Island. Leach's storm petrels recently confirmed breeding at Catalina Island. And then we go down to brown pelican. They're breeding now on Santa Barbara Island, and in 2011 they bred on San Clemente Island. Double-crested cormorants, we have breeding colonies now on Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, San Nicolas, and San Clemente Island, where in 1992 they hadn't been recorded as breeding on those islands. Brandt's cormorants, no real change in their overall breeding status. Pelagic cormorants, 2 new breeding records for San Nicolas Island, and recently 1 breeding record for San Clemente Island. And this is a picture of 2009 of pelagic cormorants nesting on San Nicolas Island. Gulls, terns, and alcids, we do have some new species records for the islands. So California gull, Caspian tern, Guadalupe murrelet, and rhinoceros auklet. Those are all new breeding records for the Channel Islands. California gull, we had a single pair that nested or attempted to nest 2 years fairly recently on East Anacapa. Caspian terns, we have a single bird attempted to breed on San Nicolas Island recently. And then on Santa Catalina Island, we have 3 different years that they were recorded breeding on Bird Rock near the Isthmus on Catalina Island. Common murres, they have bred off and on fairly recently on Prince Island at San Miguel Island. And then rhinoceros auklets, same thing. We've had some more recent breeding records for rhinoceros auklets at San Miguel Island. And then changes like scripps murrelets, they're now breeding on Anacapa, Catalina and San Clemente, and Guadalupe murrelet. They split this into 2 species, so we now have new species. They had been recorded breeding in the past on Santa Barbara Island. And then Cassin's auklets, since rats have been removed, they've started breeding on Santa Barbara Island. So the other non-passerines, this would be the doves and the owls. Spotted doves is a new breeding record for Catalina Island. Rock dove, a couple of new breeding records. We have Santa Rosa Island, and they used to breed on San Clemente, but they don't anymore. Mourning dove, we have a new breeding record for Santa Barbara Island that hadn't been reported before. Barn owls, we've confirmed breeding now on all of the islands, so we've added three additional islands for barn owls breeding there. 1 new breeding record for burrowing owl on San Clemente. Short-eared owl, they've nested in the 1980s off and on Santa Barbara Island. And here's a picture of a nest from short-eared owls in 1983, taken in 1983 by Charles Drost on Santa Barbara Island. The other non-passerines, common poorwill. This is a species of goatsucker that's been recorded calling and present in the late spring and summer months on 3 of the largest islands. But so far we have no firm evidence confirming breeding. So we don't know for certain that they're breeding there because nobody's found any nestlings or eggs yet. But that's one to be looked for still. And as hummingbirds, they've definitely expanded their breeding range on the islands. We now have them breeding on San Miguel, Santa Rosa, San Nicolas, and San Clemente. Historically, they were only breeding on Santa Cruz and Santa Catalina. And then acorn woodpecker, a recent breeding record for acorn woodpeckers on Santa Rosa Island. So a new island for them breeding. So for the passerines, rather than go through all species of passerines, I decided only to include in the passerine tables those species that have showed some change in their breeding status across the islands. If they haven't showed any breeding change in terms of islands, breeding on islands where they hadn't bred before, then I'm not including them in this overall listing. So you're only going to see the species where there's been changes. As you look at this list, there are a series of species here on the left that are in yellow. Warbling vireo, American crow, violet green swallow, and canyon wren. The ones with a question mark means we don't have confirmed breeding evidence, but we have information suggestive that they're breeding there. So I'm keeping them as question marks still. So those would be new species added to the islands. Very interesting, American crows have colonized in and around the Avalon area and Avalon Canyon on Catalina Island. They're now breeding on the island. American crows were really rare on any of the Channel Islands up until fairly recently. So what else? Black phoebes. We've added a series of islands with breeding records. So you can see we added 4 islands with new breeding records for black phoebes. Loggerhead shrikes are really interesting. We've seen disappearances of breeding populations on San Miguel, Anacapa, and Santa Barbara Island, and declines in their population on Santa Cruz Island and Catalina Island. So this change in open grassland habitat to scrubland is not as beneficial to loggerhead shrikes. And then hornlarks, they've disappeared as a breeder on Santa Barbara Island. And bush tits have now showed up as a year-round resident on Santa Rosa Island and are all likelihood of breeding now on Santa Rosa Island. So that's a new breeder for Santa Rosa Island. And canyon wrens, we have them year-round on Santa Cruz Island now in the canyons on the north side of the island. And we don't have confirmed breeding evidence in the sense of having nests, eggs, or fledglings being fed by adults. But the fact that they're there year-round and singing on territory is suggestive that there's an established population of canyon wrens now on Santa Cruz Island. We've added breeding status for blueberry gnatcatchers now on Catalina Island, and Swainson's thrushes now on Catalina Island. So in this group of passerines, we've got American robin, common yellowthroat, black-chinned sparrow, and grasshopper sparrow, all new species, never been recorded breeding on any of the Channel Islands in the past. American robin are now breeding on Santa Cruz Island, and we have evidence suggestive that they're breeding also in small numbers on Catalina Island. Common yellowthroat, again, breeding on Catalina, and suggestive evidence that they're breeding on Santa Cruz. One breeding record for black-chinned sparrow on San Clemente. And then really interesting is the grasshopper sparrows, confirmed breeding on San Clemente Island, and suggestive evidence of breeding on the 3 northern Channel Islands. Again, after herbivores were taken off the islands and the grasslands thickened up, got really thick thatch layers, and weren't being grazed, grasshopper sparrows came in and started breeding. And then a really interesting one that showed up has been song sparrow on Anacapa Island. So this is a species never been recorded breeding on Anacapa Island in the past, and it's now has confirmed evidence of breeding on Anacapa Island after the rats have been eradicated. So this is one of those benefits from the removal of rats. And we think they're showing up evidence that suggests that they may be breeding on Catalina Island also. And then dark-eyed juncos are breeding now on Santa Cruz Island. And then the last birds with changes, we've got suggestive evidence for black-headed grosbeaks on Catalina Island. Lazuli buntings is a new breeder to the Channel Islands. We've got them breeding on San Clemente Island, 2 confirmed breeding records, 1 confirmed for Santa Rosa, and suggestive evidence for their breeding on Santa Cruz and Catalina. And then hooded orioles have been recorded breeding on at the ranch on Santa Cruz Island. And then the only change in house finches has been change in abundance. They disappeared as a breeder on Santa Rosa Island, and their numbers are declining on some of the other islands. And so those are the main changes that have been occurring. Now what I'd like to do is kind of give you the numbers, the total numbers. So as we look at total numbers of birds recorded breeding, what I did is I divided this into two categories. These small columns on the bottom are all of those introduced species that were actively introduced by man or were introduced into North America and got to the islands on their own accord and established breeding. I decided to tease those out separately from all of the other native species of birds that have been recorded breeding on the island, so that the totals represented here are only for those native species, and it includes everything from waterfowl and seabirds, shorebirds, raptors. It's everything, all birds. So you can see right off, Santa Cruz Island has the largest number of species that have been recorded breeding on that island. And that's 70 species, not including the introduced species. And the fewest number of species recorded are for San Nicolas Island with 28 species. On this plot is the size of the island. So you can see the relative size of the island. And you can see that all of the larger islands, in general, have the most species breeding. And the smaller islands tend to have the fewest number of species, basically. Santa Rosa Island has fewer species than it should for its size. It should be further up, somewhere up in here for its size. Whereas Catalina Island has more species breeding than for its overall size. So those are the broad trends. If you break it out by ecological groupings, so you organize it by passerine birds or the perching birds, which would be, from flycatchers to finches, or non-passerines, raptors, shorebirds, herons, seabirds, or freshwater birds. This is how the numbers break out. So you can see kind of passerines on all of the islands make up, in general, the largest grouping of birds, of species are represented in the passeriformes. And then the next would be down in here, which are the seabirds. And I put the total numbers for each of those categories. So in purple are all the seabirds. And you can see high numbers of breeding seabirds on the smallest islands compared to high numbers of passerines breeding on the largest islands. And then these are all the raptors. That would be the next group. And again, it's the same thing. The larger islands in general tend to have the larger number of species breeding. So to summarize this, what species are benefiting and what species are not benefiting from this passive vegetation change that's occurring on the islands now that feral herbivores have been removed. When grasslands and bare ground decline, there are a series of species that are adversely affected. And this is that list of species. So American oystercatcher, mourning dove, burrowing owl, horned lark, loggerhead shrike, European starling, and house finch. All of those species are showing population declines on the islands as grasslands are declining. But there are species that are showing positive effects for changes in that grassland community structure. And 2 of these I've got pictures of, just to point out, grasshopper sparrows here, which is an obligate nester in grassland habitat. But when the islands were being grazed, it was being heavily grazed. So we had very, very short cropped grassland with little, if any, thatch left over, which didn't provide the kind of structural condition of the habitat that would allow grasshopper sparrows to build their nests in the grass on the ground and survive predation from the predators that were around. Get rid of herbivores, the grass grows up, nothing eats it, it dies, it falls over. Next year the grass grows up, it dies, it falls over, it builds up over time. It creates a thick thatch, very dense grassland community structure initially, and lo and behold, within 2 years, grasshopper sparrows established breeding on the islands under those conditions. Fast forward 20 years, that grassland's transforming into scrublands. So shrub species are beginning to grow in that grassland and beginning to spread, and the canopies of those shrubs are beginning to overlap, and they're beginning to shade out the grass underneath. And so the structure of the grassland's changing into a scrubland. Grasshopper sparrows are going to be limited to only a few areas of grassland habitat that are sustained as dense ungrazed grassland. And they're going to disappear from those broader areas where scrublands have taken over. Rufous crowned sparrows, which is an endemic subspecies of rufous crown found on Santa Cruz and Anacapa Island. On Santa Cruz Island, their populations have increased in both their distribution and their relative abundance on Santa Cruz Island following the removal of herbivores. And the reason for that is that the scrub habitat started to regenerate. Grassland began to mix in underneath the canopy of that scrubland, but there was still some openness in the scrubland habitat on the slopes. And that was really prime habitat for rufous crowned sparrows. And their populations took advantage of it. And they grew and expanded on Santa Cruz Island. Now, as that habitat is transitioning into complete scrub-dominated community with little, if any, grass in the habitat or open areas of grassland habitat, the rufous crowned sparrow populations are going to be dying back in terms of their overall abundance on the islands, on Santa Cruz Island. They're going to be more isolated to those particular slopes that still maintain that kind of structural complexity of the vegetation. So if scrublands increase, here are a few of the species that are going to be benefiting from this increase in scrubland habitat on the island. Buick's wrens, spotted towhees, again, rufous crowned sparrows, at least on Santa Cruz Island, and then lazuli buntings. And lo and behold, we've recorded new breeding records. This is a new species breeding on the islands. Hadn't been breeding there before, probably because it didn't have enough of good scrubland habitat. All right. As woodlands increase, so as oak woodlands and pine forests are increasing on the islands in the absence of grazing, those species that prefer the tree canopied part of that habitat, their populations are going to benefit from that increase. So all of these things, Allen's hummingbird, acorn woodpecker, scrub jay, all of these guys in this upper part are going to be benefiting from that change in the vegetation structure, that tree canopy that's created. But in association with that, it's not just the canopy that's changing, it's that understory habitat underneath the woodlands that's changing really dramatically. When pigs were present, it was nuked. It was rototilled underneath that habitat in the woodlands. And so you had this kind of bare ground all tilled up. You didn't have any subshrubs in that habitat. There wasn't seedling regeneration taking place. And for these near ground and ground nesters, they were impacted by that because their breeding habitat had declined. Now that has disappeared, that impact, and we have subshrubs and herbaceous vegetation growing in the understory of the woodlands, species like orange-crowned warbler, song sparrow, dark-eyed junco, and black-headed grosbeaks, all of those are going to benefit from that change in that subshrub structure underneath the dense woodland habitat. And lo and behold, we got dark-eyed juncos breeding now on Santa Cruz Island, where they hadn't been recorded breeding before. Song sparrows breeding on Anacapa Island, where they hadn't been recorded breeding before. Now, for freshwater wetlands, again, that development of freshwater marsh habitat around the margins of ponds and lakes and along the stream courses on the larger drainages on the islands is generating habitat that these freshwater breeders like. And as a result, they're coming in and starting to breed on some of the islands. And we've documented breeding now. We're pretty sure Virginia rail's breeding on Santa Rosa Island, and we've added American coot breeding records to several of the islands, mallards to 3 or 4 of the islands, ruddy duck to 1 of the islands, common yellowthroat to 2 of the islands, again, song sparrow to Anacapa Island, and we think to Catalina Island. So we're already seeing those changes happen, and it's because the habitat is there. If you get the habitat, those species, when they're migrating across the island, are going to find the habitat. And if they find it suitable, they're going to live in it. As the riparian woodlands begin to regenerate, there are an additional series of species that are going to benefit from that tree canopied habitat, and these are just a few of them. Northern flicker, ash-throated flycatcher, warbling vireo, and Swainson's thrush are species that I expect are going to benefit from that kind of change in the woodland habitat. So in conclusion, over the last 150 years, we've been able to document 105 species of birds that have nested on 1 or more of the islands at one point in time. They're not all nesting there today, but over that 150-year time window, we have 105 species that we have records for now as having bred on the islands. From the 1980s up to the present, we have 27 species that are new first-time breeders for the Channel Islands from this additional kind of harvesting of these records. And 8 that would be new. They're suspected of breeding on the islands. We still need better evidence to confirm them as breeding. There have been a total of 67 new island-specific breeding records. That's where a species hadn't been recorded breeding on an individual island before, but they're breeding there now. So 67 separate little changes in breeding status on the islands. And then 59 island-specific breeding status changes. That means where they had been listed as questionable as breeding or as occasional. They may now be common or a resident breeder. So those breeding status changes are also occurring on quite a few of the islands. 3 species have been eradicated from the islands, including wild turkey, Indian peafowl, and golden eagle. We have 2 native raptors that have been reintroduced back onto the islands, bald eagle and peregrine falcons. Bald eagles are breeding on all but 3 of the islands now, and peregrine falcons are breeding on all 8 of the islands. And then we have 5 species that this change in habitat following the removal of herbivores is resulting in some changes in breeding status for these 5 species. So we have loggerhead shrikes have disappeared as breeders on San Miguel, Anacapa, and Santa Barbara Island and declined on 2 of the other islands. Horned larks have disappeared as a breeder on Anacapa. Common raven has disappeared as a breeder on Santa Barbara and San Nicolas Island. And European starlings no longer breed on San Miguel, Anacapa, or Santa Barbara Island. And house finches no longer breed on Santa Barbara Island. So these are, during the question period, these are some pictures that have been sent to me of confirmed breeding records or evidence that confirms a breeding occurrence of a given species on an island where they hadn't bred before. So as you look at these images, we've got pelagic cormorant up here on the left on San Nicolas Island, and a hummingbird feeding a nestling here. Dark-eyed juncos, an adult with a juvenile right here. In 2013. The first breeding record for a killer on San Clemente Island. Here's a chick. Here's an acorn storage tree, and then they're actually nest holes in this ironwood tree on Santa Rosa Island. And then, of course, mallard on San Nicolas Island in 2010. So I'll open it to questions. A lot of changes going on the islands, and they're going to continue to be a lot of changes as these islands are changing in terms of their habitat, and then as the islands change as a result of the effects of global warming. At this point, we don't know how that also is going to be affecting changes in breeding status on a number of these species on the islands. But it's an exciting time to be around as a biologist working on the islands, because when I started 40 years ago working out on the Channel Islands, these big islands were all ranches, and they had grazing animals all over them. And so my understanding of the fauna of the islands at that time was based on that work that took place when it was actively being managed as a ranching operation, and the habitats had all been changed. Now, fast forward 40 years later, and we're seeing these dramatic changes in vegetative community structure, which are really driving changes in the faunal composition on each of these islands. As a result of the removal of those herbivores. So yeah, it's an exciting time to be around. Kind of watch and see how quickly it's happening, that transition.
Okay, my question is regarding the golden eagle.
Yes.
One of the slides showed that they were taken off of Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz.
Yeah, they were trapped and relocated into the Great Basin.
Okay, that was the question. Where do they end up?
The bulk of the animals, the adults, the paired adults, were trapped and taken up north of Reno and released east of the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Range. And then they had some of them satellite tagged, some of them radio tagged, and they followed tracks of these things. They moved all up through the Great Basin, up into Idaho and Montana and Utah, and wandered around feeding on jackrabbits, which is their preferred prey, not island foxes. So 2006 was when the last adult breeding pair of golden eagles was trapped and relocated off the island of Santa Cruz.
Yes, my question is, the shorebirds or seabirds that breed on the islands. I've heard that we wouldn't have very many of them along the coast, if it wasn't for our Channel Islands? Is it the seabirds or the shorebirds that we're speaking about?
Seabirds.
Seabirds.
Yeah, yeah. The diversity and the abundance of the seabirds that breed on the California Channel Islands is significant for seabird breeding populations along the west coast of North America.
Thank you.
I mean, we have some of the largest concentrations of breeding species on islands like Prince Island, San Miguel, and Santa Barbara Island, of any place along the west coast of North America. So,
I have a question. Is most of the birds that are on the islands, are they from migratory birds that are landing there and then creating populations, or are there any endemic species?
there are a variety. Well, all of the birds that have gotten to the island, other than the game birds that man carried out there and released in order to have peacocks and turkeys and quail to hunt on the islands, got there on their own accord. So even things like European starling and house sparrows, which are non-native species that were introduced into North America, they eventually found their way and flew out and landed on some of the islands and established breeding populations. All of the other birds have gotten there, some of which stayed and established breeding populations and didn't migrate off the islands. And over millennia, evolution began selecting for unique morphological and genetic characteristics within their populations from island to island as you move across that chain, depending on how long of a period of isolation they had in each island population. So there are about 8 or 10 species that show endemism. There's one endemic species, the island scrub jay, found only on Santa Cruz Island today, but I have fossil evidence for it now on San Miguel Island and Santa Rosa Island in the past. And then the rest of them are all either near endemics, where we have a population that breeds in a small area on the mainland, but then is found on a series of the Channel Islands, or the length of time that they've been isolated hasn't created enough real strong genetic divergence between the adjacent mainland population, so weakly diverged in terms of their morphology and their genetics. So the thing that's really revolutionizing our understanding of the evolution of that resident breeding fauna, avifauna, the endemic breeding avifauna of the islands, is the mitochondrial DNA work that's going on now, where they can really look at the length of time that populations have diverged from each other, how each island population is related to each other, how long they've been separated, how long the island populations have been separated from mainland populations. So we get a much better, clearer understanding of how evolution has been changing and modifying those island populations. So an example would be a woman recently finished her master's thesis doing a study on the genetics of spotted towhees on the Channel Islands. And they breed on Santa Cruz Island, Santa Rosa Island, Catalina Island, and San Clemente Island. They're extinct on San Clemente Island. They died out by the 1960s. But all of the other islands, they're still present. When she did the mitochondrial DNA analysis, each of those populations showed enough genetic divergence to warrant full species recognition. So we're going from a single species and only 2 subspecies recognized for the island to potentially 4 unique endemic subspecies, or a potentially full species recognition for several of those on the Channel Islands. And we're going to see that in a number of other species as these genetic studies get underway, and they cover more of the islands where those species occur. So it's pretty exciting to kind of see that kind of stuff going on now.
I wanted to ask, how much has restoring habitat planting on the islands affected the bird populations, and have you had more success in certain restoration?
I'm not that close to the botanical work that's been taking place in the revegetation. I'm looking at the kind of the broad scale picture of what's happening on an island, as opposed to the narrow picture of a particular area they're doing active management in. Like on Anacapa Island, East Anacapa Island, they removed all of the ice plant and have revegetated with native plant species. I don't know of data that's been taken before the ice plant was removed and then after that habitat develops to kind of identify what species have benefited from that change of that getting rid of that introduced ice plant. But there are cases where there's been that really active management going on in order to regenerate habitat. Santa Barbara Island's a good example. I think Scorpion Rock is another good example. They've been doing a lot of revegetation work on Scorpion Rock. to create the kind of natural vegetative community structure that provides better protection for the burrow nesting seabirds that visit their burrow nest sites at night, to reduce the predation that owls would have on them. They're revegetating the top of that island. And so those things are important. But across the overall island, there hasn't been a lot of active work in trying to manage that change from grassland to scrubland. It's happening. It's taking place. It's a natural progression that's happening. And it's going to continue to happen.
Yeah, I have a quick question about albatross. I understand albatrosses come from Hawaii to our islands. Is this? But I didn't see any of it on your.
We have no breeding evidence for either of the 3 species of albatrosses that are found in the North Pacific on any of the Channel Islands. However, we have a lot of evidence out of the archaeological record of the occurrence of short-tailed albatross skeletal material in archaeological contexts, suggesting that Native Americans were hunting them and harvesting the birds when they were in close to the islands. And so that's a species that gets close to the islands. The other 2 species of albatross, the Laosin and black-footed albatross, are primarily open ocean species of albatross. Like the black-footed, it nests in the Central Pacific on the outer Hawaiian Islands. And during the breeding season, those birds transit all the way to the west coast of North America, feed along the escarpment of the continental shelf escarpment where it drops off into deep ocean. They feed along that escarpment, turn around, fly back, feed their young, turn around, fly back to the west coast, feed, back, feed their young. They do that all through the breeding season. Whereas the Laosin albatrosses in Hawaii, they don't go that direction. They go north, and they go up to the convergence zone between the cold Arctic waters and the subtropical waters, which are about 1,500 or 2,000 miles north of the Hawaiian Islands. And they fly straight north, feed around there, come back, feed their young, fly back, feed around there, come back. And they do that all through the breeding season. So these are birds that are covering thousands of miles of ocean on a weekly basis just to feed their young. And it's pretty phenomenal.
I don't know if this is on or not, but my question is, do you have permanent observers on the islands?
No. The only island that has relatively good coverage in terms of breeding observation on a continual basis is San Clemente Island. And the reason for that is they have a series of research scientists that are hired to manage and work on the loggerhead shrike recovery program and the San Clemente bell sage sparrow recovery program, and several other species of birds. And so they're there 24/7 all year long, and they got into birding on their free time. And those records were being entered initially into an Excel database, which they shared with me, and I was able to kind of harvest information out of that Excel database. And then subsequently, a lot of those individuals are posting their checklists daily up to eBird. So you can go into eBird and you can see what the most recent sightings have been for San Clemente Island, or for a particular species on San Clemente Island. And so some of that breeding evidence is coming out of those checklists that get posted.
You were talking about albatross flying these great miles and miles. Albatross, I think of as big, very strong birds. But how do these little tiny guys get the 26 miles out to the islands to start a breeding colony? How do they do that?
Well, a lot of these land birds, the ones that breed to the north of us and into the interior, that have to get out of those areas during the winter, and they have to migrate into warmer climate areas. They're migrating on the west coast of North America. They're migrating oftentimes in a north-south direction, or they come to the coast and then migrate north-south down the coast of California. Well, if you look at a map of California, the map of California comes down kind of north-south, and then it hits Point Conception and goes, and then drops back to a north-south by northern Baja California. Well, there's the Southern California bight where that changes. If you're flying north-south down along the coast and you stay north-south, you go right over the Channel Islands. And then, boom, you're onto northern Baja California if you stay in that north-south transit. And you have a series of these islands to be able to stop on while you're passing over the water. On the northward migration, it's very different because they're not they're kind of moving their way up through Mexico into Western North America through a variety of routes. And they don't have a direct north-south route that'll take them out to the islands. And so you get a different kind of migratory pattern of birds as they move, when they're moving north-south as they're coming to get up to their breeding areas. So, but we have some banded birds, some birds that were banded on San Nicolas Island, like white-crowned sparrows, that came back to San Nicolas Island, 51 miles offshore, 3 winters in a row. And these are birds that likely bred all the way up in northern Canada or Alaska. So they migrated all the way down along the west coast of North America, wintered on San Nicolas Island, then migrated all the way back up and bred, came all the way back down. And so there's a little bit of evidence like that of birds that have been banded and recaptured, indicating that they're showing these really long distance movements and this, wanting to stay on an island during the winter, to winter. They find the habitat suitable. So,
We
yes.
have time for one more question.
In your research, have you seen any indication of ingesting plastic?
In the albatrosses, I've seen plastic, and in a few of the other seabirds when I've worked on them for specimens going into the collection. But albatrosses in general are picking up bits and pieces of plastic that are floating. I haven't gotten fresh specimens from around the islands. These are albatrosses that are coming out of the North Pacific, out of off the Aleutian Islands and out in the Bering Sea that are getting caught in longline fisheries. And out of those incidental fisheries caught birds, they're actually having ingested plastics from foraging out, around that upper rim of the Pacific. I got a little bit of plastic out of a short-tailed albatross I worked on that washed in dead at Morro Bay. But that's a bird that it left the breeding colony on the island southeast of Japan a month and a half before it showed up dead on Morro Bay. So it transited from southeast of Japan all the way up along Asia to the Aleutians, around the Aleutians, all the way down the west coast of North America to Morro Bay, this juvenile, before he showed up dead. So.
We'll have one last question. This is very interesting.
Thank you. It's regarding the Santa Cruz Island jay, and
Yes.
I recently heard that they're starting to differentiate a little bit in between the different habitats, that their beak is changing. Is that true?
Yeah, they've found this micro geographic variation within the population on Santa Cruz Island between the pine forest habitats and the oak woodland habitats, from the east end of the island to the west end of the island. And so by live capturing and taking a suite of measurements on the bills and of banded birds, so they could kind of monitor the home range size of where those birds were hanging out, they were able to gather data that documented morphological differentiation between the populations that were in one type of habitat, pine forest, in one area of the island compared to another habitat that was in another area of the island away from it. And it's really one of the first cases of a large vertebrate that they found evidence to actually show active evolution taking place. And that's the first. A woman did her PhD thesis on this work.
And with all of the pine trees dying, have you seen any effect with the birds, with the terrible loss of all the pines on Santa Cruz?
There's going to be a decline in the species that benefit from the pine canopy habitat, the canopy part of the structure of that habitat. But the subshrub understory habitat of that forest is going to change. It's filling in with denser scrub cover. And that's going to benefit a whole suite of species that like that scrub covered habitat. And you're going to get seedling regeneration starting for pines coming up through that. And over time, it'll recanopy over the scrub and kind of have this kind of dieback in the scrub cover underneath that canopy. So it's a progression, and you're going to see that cyclical change in these habitats. Whether this decline in the pine forests on Santa Cruz Island is going to be long-term and that is going to be kept in place by increasing temperatures from climate change as we look out into the future, that's yet to be seen. I mean, if you had a fire going at right now and burned it, you'd see a real dramatic change in the overall structure, and you'd see a hell of a lot of seedling regeneration in that habitat take place, because that's what it's adapted for. So you'd see a lot of new growth. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.